Anyway, I'm sort of indebted to the University of Torino because Revista de Aesthetica has already published 4 of my papers. So I feel really a part of your team on one way and another, which I'm going to explain in a minute. Okay, so let me get my screen up. Weird, okay. Okay. All right, so I want to begin by setting the stage here, since I imagine it seems odd that an esthetician with a career in curating is suddenly crafting papers in environmental ethics, and especially papers that depend more on scientific evidence than ethical argument. By the time I arrived at Temple University to begin my doctoral studies in 2006, I had already authored Ecovention, Current Art to Transform Ecologies, which explained dozens of large-scale artworks meant to address ecological issues in line with environmental values. While Joseph Beuys's 7,000 Eichen, and Dennis's Tree Mountain, and George Steinman's Coat Me, a growing sculpture, specifically mitigate climate change. I can talk about these later if there's questions, but anyway. Tisha Johansson's Lagoon and Betsy Damon's The Living Water Garden illuminate water's role in cooling the planet. Even so, I don't think the word climate change is mentioned once in the accompanying 160-page book. So when I curated a similar exhibition focused on Europe in 2017, I specifically added a chapter highlighting artworks focused on climate change. In fact, every work discussed in my eco-art surveys effectively mitigates climate change. So I want to draw your attention to this map of the Ecovention Europe. So what I did was the book discusses maybe hundreds of projects of art inspired by nature. And here's Italy, and it's relevant for the next page. It's a little detail, but you can see Torino's over here, Venice. Anyway, so I added up the score of each, I added up the score of each city, Venezia 32, Warsaw 29, whatever, and Team Italia wins with 57 points. So then an artist made this plaque, you can't really see it, but it says, awarded to Italia on the 3rd of September for supporting the most number of artworks and exhibitions inspired by nature. Actually handed it to the ambassador of Italy in The Hague because the show was in the Netherlands. Anyway, it's just an interesting aside here. I told you I was indebted to Italy in more ways than one. Okay. So back at Temple, we read Charles Bates, Tim Hayward, and Thomas Pogge, with whom I'd actually studied some 20 years earlier when he was a Columbia postdoc. It was at Temple that I began to formulate my initial criticisms of their distinct accounts of distributive justice as applied to environmental degradations, which became the basis of my 2010 paper, Reconfiguring the Global Environmental Justice Paradigm, Groundwater Justice's Prior Status, that I presented at the Integrating Development and Climate Change Ethics Conference, organized by the Rock Ethics Institute. I offer this brief background to make the following point. Because my interest in ecological and environmental ethics originated in the art world, where I've curated 10 exhibitions featuring practical artworks with ecological intent, my philosophical approach to environmental ethics is no less pragmatic. When philosophy addresses real-world problems, it must identify strategies that ordinary citizens can implement rather than await governmental leaders, which is why I stress congruence. On this level, Italy's slow food movement is an exemplary case, if only UNFCCC's attendees understood its relevance for climate change. That said, I'm also keenly interested in self-knowledge and behavioral economics, two fields that explore the way human beings unwittingly act against their interests. These past 2 years have made it clear that we human beings are not particularly committed to personal responsibility, let alone moral responsibility. Regarding climate change, not only have we done things that aggravate it, but we willfully continue to do so, despite our recognizing the consequences. This is perhaps the greatest example of our behaving against our interests. The paper I'm presenting today is meant to be one of the last chapters of a book I'm currently working on called Making Values Explicit, a sly reference to Robert Brandam's Making It Explicit. Ordinarily, our values are not only implicit, but we're not so forthright with those that we have identified, unless we're actively engaged in political demagoguery. It seems to me that the only way to get people to modify their actions is to encourage them to make their values explicit so that they can admit whether their actions reflect their values. That said, rather than open up US oil reserves, I wish Biden would implore Americans to drive less in solidarity with Ukraine. Okay, so I guess, okay. All right, so to be congruent, a philosophical approach to climate change, I just want to make sure I'm on the right. I'm on 6. Yeah, it must be right. Here we go. So to be congruent, a philosophical approach for climate change mitigation must persuade the greatest number of climate change contributors, both producers and consumers, to modify offending actions to achieve the public's environmental values. Even as citizens increasingly articulate their desire for governments to implement strategies that mitigate climate change, consumers still fail to adopt the requisite lifestyles needed to reduce carbon footprints, thus hindering governmental efforts to advance the public's environmental values. Consider that the continued rise in SUV purchases worldwide has caused gasoline consumption to far exceed carbon footprint savings earned by recently constructed energy-efficient power plants and industrial factories. More worrisome still, transnational corporations tend to treat economic sanctions meant to deter them from degrading environments as just the cost of doing business, rather than as prohibitions against undesirable actions or penalties befitting said crimes. This is the well-known failure of backward-looking schemes such as retributive justice. Even if victims consider payouts fair, possibly enormous sums in terms of their economic standards, no amount of money can truly compensate inhabitants whose environments have been degraded and or properties destroyed. Following Iraq's 7-month occupation of Kuwait in 1990, UN staff members worked extra hard to implement programs that delivered aid directly to victims, rather than enacting economic sanctions that are distinctly retributive. Karen and Morris defined the UN Compensation Commission's notion of practical justice as being the sort of justice whose delivery is swift and efficient and not rough. On this level, practical refers more to how justice is carried out rather than a particular type of justice. The UN avoids retributive schemes because they fail to persuade bad actors to reform and tend to encourage business as usual so long as profits outweigh extant fines. I say this to give a little background to how all the climate change conferences go. I think they really seem to be focused on practical justice. In contrast to practical values, I use environmental values to indicate inhabitants' environmental preferences and ameliorative values to reflect the will to enhance human and non-human well-being alike, whereas explicit values are those that value holders capably express. Not all environmental values are explicit, and not all explicit values concern the environment. Unlike the earlier Kyoto Protocol, whose signatories are primarily developed nations, the Paris Agreement and Katowice Climate Package gather the world's nations together in entirely voluntary agreements. Treating climate change as a shared problem is meant to motivate each signatory to establish its own target for reducing emissions in order to limit the rise in temperature by 2100 to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Every 5 years, countries are supposed to assess their progress towards implementing the agreement through a process known as the global stocktake. The first is planned for next year. So I sort of make a joke that it's kind of like a national slimming contest. By being voluntary, the world is going on a diet. You know, we have some sort of globally accepted whitelist goals, and people have their own dieting strategies, and next year we're all going to get weighed. I think a national diet sounds very difficult. But anyway, okay. Countries set their own targets, and there are no enforcement mechanisms to ensure they meet them. Given each nation's varying per capita carbon footprints, the belt tightening required to achieve this consensus-driven global target varies enormously. Moreover, non-compliant nations such as Australia, Brazil, China, or the United States are sometimes called cheaters, but they have thus far escaped penalties. Okay. Compensate nations for costs accrued by mitigation and adaptation strategies meant to ward off climate change's impact on coastal cities, river cities, flooded farms, islands, and rural villages. Several philosophers have proposed distributive justice schemes. When framed such that polluters owe an ecological debt, wealthy nations have a responsibility to help those less fortunate. I guess that's Hayward's view. well, Hayward ecological debt by its responsibility, or nations whose economies have directly benefited from climate emissions owe a negative due. That's POGI. All right, such ideal principles as the polluter pays principle, the ability to pay principle, and the beneficiary pays principle prove no less backward-looking than retributive justice schemes. Whether funds are paid out directly or pooled and distributed on a case-by-case basis, citizens inhabiting pair nations are rarely burdened by said sanctions and thus fail to alter their climate-warming lifestyles. Changing our bad habits requires our constant reflection upon the costs or burdens paid by others for our poor choices. For example, people who empathize with animals inhabiting factory farms are more likely to switch protein sources. Similarly, those envisioning poorly paid miners, slaving for hours on end in diamond mines, or each gold bands generating 20 tons of mining waste will opt for secondhand rings. Such ideal principles formulated by philosophers to compensate potential victims extend John Rawls' notion of distributive justice, a socio-political and/or economic template available shared language users inhabiting a polis to select and implement their conception of fairness. Not only are values implicit in each member's conception of fairness, but they play a central role in its original conception. All social values, liberty and opportunity, income and wealth, and the social basis of self-respect are to be distributed equally unless an unequal distribution of any or all of these values is to everyone's advantage. Injustice, then, is simply inequalities that are not to the benefit of all. Additionally, the utilities represent the worth of the alternatives for this person as estimated by his scheme of values. So some of the values in Rawls' program are explicit, but he doesn't really make any attempt to encourage them to be explicit. I mean, they're usually borrowed from either the US Constitution or John Locke or something like that. Okay, environmental justice, which addresses inequitable conditions befalling environments that sustain both human and non-human inhabitants, is neither redistributable nor compensatory, since no amount of money can reverse environmental degradation. Distributive justice may remedy global injustices resulting from financial burdens, property losses, or unequal resource allocations, but it makes a farce of climate change since it fails to prevent consumers from actions that exacerbate temperature rises. So long as backward-looking schemes fail to thwart bad actors, they fail to achieve global environmental justice, let alone climate justice. More recently, Simon Caney introduced a forward-looking notion of distributive justice. Yet, as the next section demonstrates, the fact that climate change targets are global, while burdens and values are local, engenders asymmetries between targets and burdens, making his ideal principle unworkable. As we shall see, even the most disciplined actors reject burdens deemed onerous or relevant. This is, again, back to my diet, global diet scenario. Okay. But to diminish the asymmetry between local burdens and global targets, this paper proposes the values approach, which builds upon the significance of non-human rights, whose articulation empowers value holders to acknowledge, monitor, and safeguard values made explicit in word and or deed. Implementing the values approach requires value holders to routinely reflect upon their lifestyle's immediate and long-term impact in order to modify present habits and preferences. According to the values approach, mitigating climate change depends on value holders who view their every action as expressing core beliefs that indicate their particular identity. Non-inhabitants and those who claim contrary beliefs, such as foreigners and climate deniers, are no less culpable for causing harmful actions elsewhere. Since sound judgment is a universal value, harmful outcomes convey people's terrible choices and/or poor judgment. Despite being voluntary, I envision people concerned by climate change finding it easier to adhere to the values approach since people's choices reflect their identities, which is hardly the case for current mitigation strategies. All right, so now I'm going to go into this asymmetry between the just targets and the just burdens. All right, given the extraordinary income gap between wealthy and poor nations, COP delegates to the UNFCCC have implemented forward-looking variants of distributive justice, such that wealthier countries voluntarily incur greater burdens to offset the opportunity costs of burdens that prove unfair for poorer countries. What counts as a burden varies from situation to situation. Sometimes poor nations access the Green Climate Fund to offset expenses caused by implementing renewable energy resources or building factories that emit fewer greenhouse gases. Alternatively, wealthier nations that agree to implement more expensive greenhouse gas reducing energy generators, gas reducing energy generators. Okay. According to two German nonprofits, Climate Analytics and the New Climate Institute, even if nations manage to adhere to their pledges, the temperature will rise an undesirable 2.6 degrees by 2100. Clearly, each nation's pledge is not only insufficient to meet the global target, but their citizens, whether on the individual, institutional, or industrial level, deem their participation too burdensome, since they've already driven temperatures 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial levels, leaving room for only a 0.4 degree rise over the next 80 years. Therein lies the rub. How do nations with many millions, even billions of people, motivated citizens who not only can afford today's conveniences, but have worked extra hard to establish lifestyles built on convenience, to now adopt inconvenient lifestyles, local burdens, such that they must limit air travel, forego online purchases, curtail electronics, pay more for locally sourced food, opt for public transportation, and heat cool less in order to achieve global targets? Only a severe belt tightening will enable nations to regularly adjust their emissions reducing pledge in order to meet goals established elsewhere. After all, strong economies are built on the principle that affordability entitles one to the right to purchase it. How do we now redirect the attitudes of millions of people whose fundamental motivation to earn more money is to acquire previously inaccessible goods? This is no less difficult a prospect than placing a nation's citizens on a voluntary diet in order to achieve internationally agreed upon healthy weights. When it comes to accepting burdens that mitigate climate change, Swedes have proven their willingness to accept costly burdens, such as taking long-distance international trains instead of flying, having Europe's smallest families, and paying fees for cars to enter cities, including Gothenburg, the headquarters of Volvo. Until recently, Sweden consistently outranked every other nation on the Climate Change Performance Index. This year, Denmark was one, but before, Sweden was always number one. Such disciplined behavior articulates Swedes' environmental values. Moreover, their identity reflects their natural environment, so they clearly consider it imperative to defeat global warming before its effects reach Sweden. Extreme climes affecting the health of forests, lakes, and agricultural lands elsewhere pose a huge threat to Swedes' fish and berry diet, if not their outdoor lifestyle. To my lights, pragmatic Swedes literally defied Keynes' forward-looking model during the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. Despite just targets, minimize community spread, they refused to endure just burdens, globally recommended measures, as if the opportunity costs far outweighed their advantages, saving lives while minimizing stress on healthcare workers, first responders, and hospital supplies. Puggy remarked early on that it's difficult for societies to curb consumption and pollution when opportunity costs are perceived as exceeding long-term benefits, thus anticipating my observation that burdens perceived as unjust make achieving just targets exceedingly difficult. Unlike Swedes whose livelihoods depend on their environment's health, transnational corporations typically operate in foreign lands far from their corporate headquarters. By contrast, UNFCCC meetings focused on climate change regularly assemble thousands of delegates committed to protecting their unique environments. These thousands of environmental value holders exemplify the view, how can you destroy a world if you're hooked into it? And then the big question is, how can we hook people into the world as solidly as the Swedes are hooked into theirs? Okay. Since each COP delegate hails from a unique environment, each feels duty-bound to defend a particular territory in order to ensure their community's well-being and prosperity, as well as that of future generations and inhabitants. By expanding the number of delegates well beyond that of typical UN member nations representatives, the COP process enables many more voices to be heard, which makes this process invaluable. As a result, many more stories are voiced, recorded, and evaluated than would otherwise be known. Moreover, such a diverse range of global witnesses enhances conference attendees' capacities to empathize with and understand situations that differ from most delegates' personal experiences. One of the implicit advantages of the COP process is the thunderous chorus of prevailing values, which has led the world's citizens to increasingly recognize and understand the importance of attributing rights such as liberty, autonomy, equality, and fairness to non-human actors such as waterways, plants, and animals. Non-human rights are considered on par with the UN's 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which only 48 out of 58 UN members originally voted for. Yet 70 years later, it is widely accepted. Since then, additional conventions have been drawn up and signed to protect rights related to children, refugees, and disabled persons, among others. No doubt the global community will continue adding more rights. Non-human rights currently in play across the planet recognize and protect the rights of local environments such as forests, rivers, glaciers, mountains, ancient territories, and even wild rice. The move to recognize non-human rights differs from the Non-Human Rights Project, an NGO focused on animal rights. Meanwhile, communities in 7 nations have adopted laws, and in some cases constitutions, to protect non-human actors' rights. Switzerland's constitution recognizes the dignity of individual plants, while Colombia's Supreme Court recently ruled that the Amazon River is a rights-bearing entity. In adopting such documents, citizens have made their environmental values, which include non-human rights, explicit. No doubt, enacting non-human rights across the globe will be insufficient to curtail bad actors from profiting off of other people's cherished environments. So that's the problem. That in itself isn't sufficient, but let's try to find another approach. However, just as citizens of nearly 90 nations have pushed their political representatives to draft constitutions that address human rights, locals will elect politicians whose platforms aim to defend popularly held environmental values, including non-human rights. Such rights publicize people's special appreciation for beings that are ordinarily overlooked and thus risk being unacknowledged. When environmental values are made explicit, local inhabitants' defense of non-human rights is warranted. Bound together in a joint venture, value holders feel authorized to govern and protect invaluable beings in their shared care, granting special attention to particular places' non-human inhabitants. Even if such values are merely local, the value holder's authority is rather universal, since outsiders will be forced to recognize such rights, however outre. Such values are likely to reflect obscure populations' peculiar proclivities, leaving transnational corporations no other option than to deploy corporate lobbyists to fight the popularization of non-human rights, precisely because making values explicit empowers value holders to take legal actions that thwart harmful outsiders. One argument, next slide. Okay. The one argument against granting non-human right being right on par with human beings is that what drives us to value non-human rights is rather emotionally infused, making such actions morally unjustifiable since we lack valid reasons. So long as our reasons remain out of reach, critics can claim that COP delegates who find others' testimonies persuasive or citizens who elect politicians because they promise to extend human rights are simply swayed by their emotions. As such, non-human rights advocates are merely responding to happy pictures of cute animals, sad stories regarding species loss, or anger prompting images of industrial wastelands. Politicians may even use such tactics to lure votes. As we shall see, we're right to worry that basic emotions such as sadness, happiness, fear, disgust, anger, and surprise might influence our thoughts, since they sometimes engender beliefs that inadvertently alter or conflict with our values. However, images of environmental degradation that catch our attention and trigger emotional responses rarely prompt us to take action. A picture or story may alert us to problems caused by non-human beings' lack of rights, but taking action requires first-hand knowledge of the environment's conditions, the belief that what we value demands protection, plus an awareness of our options. According to Brunn et al., it might be the case that although emotions do not themselves represent or present values, they are nevertheless associated with some sort of intentional relation to values. Emotions should therefore be described as reactions to felt danger, injustice, or other values, or to what seems to be the felt danger of objects, the felt injustice of situations. This view seems right, since emotions seem to signal values. Problem is, some philosophers don't consider acting on feelings on par with acting for a reason. To sidestep this quagmire, Julie Tannenbaum distinguishes the manner of doing something, how, from one's motive, reasons why. In so doing, she demonstrates that emotionally infused actions, such as compassionately comforting one's own child, can be considered acting from duty and are thus no less morally motivated. Since our emotional responses can be misleading, it's imperative that we double-check them as we do ordinary perception. For example, many people get nervous and agitated when a bee flies by. They obviously fear getting stung, but when asked what they think of bees, they typically recognize bees' importance as pollinators of flowers, fruits, nuts, and vegetables. Our fears are real, but our emotions are not veridical in the sense that they're not foolproof, reliable indicators of our thoughts. Similarly, people who find moldy food disgusting tend to discard it straight away. Others find it no less disgusting, but they have little qualms scraping mold off the jam or rinsing it off peels prior to preparing marmalade. As we age, we learn when to distrust disgust, and how to substantiate our emotional responses. When we instigate harmful actions, we're either bad actors whose actions align with our perverse values, or our terrible judgments facilitate events that have effectively betrayed our values. Destructive choices reveal far more about our values than rational pleas, let alone emotional responses, which are easily primed, if not misleading. And primed emotions, especially our fears, tend to perverse our judgments. Those of us who self-identify as doing our part to mitigate climate change always regularly engage value juggling, even if we don't literally weigh the impact of every choice versus our articulated values. In prioritizing family safety over carbon emissions, most consumers deem SUVs safer than cars. Fortunately, our identities play selective roles, helping us to modify our actions, but only if we've made our values, backed by knowledge, explicit. Some consider climate change as posing a far greater danger to their descendants than the risk of head-on collisions, whose cars are increasingly at risk of getting hit by larger vehicles. SUVs' perceived safety mostly reflects their predominance. They're bigger, that's why they're safer. Let's return to non-human beings' rights values. Those of us who get wrapped up in advocating for particular environmental causes, such as non-human rights, are driven by our passions, which are what Stoker calls enacted emotions. In other words, even if we don't know the content of our beliefs, we soon discover what we're willing to go to bat for. No doubt, the fact of caring affects our judgments by making us recognize certain facts as reasons to act. Similarly, feelings of love, admiration, disappointment, or resentment effectively prompt direct action, even though we may not be able to grasp, let alone explain the actual causes or underlying reasons for said feelings, let alone result in actions. On this level, our actions serve as evidence for our beliefs, which eventually guide us to articulate our values. Emotions that are felt but remain unarticulated or unnoticed are not beliefs. By contrast, when we act on our passions, they become dispositional like belief. We, or perhaps our friends, glean our passions from our actions, enabling our passions to become belief-like, articulatable. Similarly, values that remain unarticulated become belief-like when we act on them. If we come for a less resource exploitative and energy intense car, but leave with an SUV, since the salesperson stressed family safety, we're articulating different values, even if the salesperson tricked us. When we don't properly exercise our judgment, we risk acting on beliefs colored more by emotions than values. By contrast, those who are passionate about watersheds, because they connect waterways, cool the planet, and nourish the region's myriad living beings, are acting on far more than mere emotions such as surprise or delight. Okay, here's my last slide. Conclusion. All right, virtue ethics. Let's see where we have for time. Okay, virtue ethics posits ethics as a kind of long-winded checklist of virtues, for which we relate to a handful, though certainly not all. By contrast, values are personally held, idiosyncratic beliefs that reflect our character because they are infused with our personal identities. Values are a subset of what Kasim Kassam terms substantial self-knowledge, which includes knowledge of our character, values, abilities, attitudes, reasons, emotions, and what makes us happy, a matter of degree. When framed as idiosyncratic beliefs, values appear to lack normativity, but in fact, their distinct relationship to our identity grants them normativity because they reflect our commitment to bear witness to our identities. We and our observers discover our values through routine daily actions. When our actions don't cohere with what we claim to be our values, we feel pressure to change the one or the other, lest we be deemed hypocrites. The values approach also applies to politicians and corporations whose inconsistent policies and poor judgments harm environments and citizens alike. While virtues belong to someone else, whichever philosopher assembled the list, our values are our own, which means that we can pass them to friends, fellow inhabitants, and future generations to become shared values. In fact, the psychologists Rosenhait and Macaulay note that values, rather than mere preferences, drive the social practices that get passed from generation to generation. Moralization converts preferences into values, and in doing so, influences cross-generational transmission because values are passed more effectively in families than our preferences. And this increases the likelihood of internalization and invokes greater emotional responses and mobilizes the support of government and other cultural institutions. Similarly, Alexandria Plakias argues that food ethics protects us from foods embodying toxic values, values that threaten not our physical health, but our ideological integrity and therefore our very identity. Another reference to the slow food movement. This notion coheres with research that shows that vegetarians who are vegetarians for moral rather than health reasons register stronger pangs of disgust towards meat. Being a moral vegetarian reflects values that inform their self-identities. When we live according to our values, we feel pride precisely because our values are ours and not someone else's. Rather than worry that what people will think if we don't own a car, public transport advocates take pride in their transport choices. Those who are working to make the world water law as common as the rights of children or the disabled act according to their own, as common as the rights of children or the disabled act according to their own values. Our original concerns regarding climate change may have been prompted by pictures or stories, but modifying our habits such that we are decreasingly climate change offenders requires that we grasp the situation at hand and dedicate our lives to making our values explicit so that we are prepared to uphold ameliorative values, environmental values, non-human beings, rights values, or some combination therein. Thank you very much. Okay. I hope I didn't read too fast. I'm totally happy to share my paper if anyone is interested.
Great, thank you. No, it was not too fast. I think that we were able to follow you quite well. So, no, I raised my own hands, which is not. So, who wanted to intervene?
Has anyone written philosophy papers on the slow food movement? They must have.
Ah, great. You wrote about this topic.
No. I said, has anyone written a philosophy paper on the slow food movement as a philosophical?
Yeah. I'm not sure, but
yeah, but I think it's the best example of a grassroots approach that had a global impact and changed loads of people's attitudes towards food or towards the environment.
Okay. So we can open the discussion. I can say something just to introduce some topics for the discussion. I'm sure that colleagues which are expert in ethics and in other file near ethics can say something more interesting than me. But I have I think a minor points, but it's a curiosity about the part of that part of the presentation in which to say something about the way of using or the way to apply the notion of human rights to non-humans. Because keywords like freedom, for example, usually are attributed to humans, not to non-human beings. So I want to say something more about this. What do you mean by attributing human rights to non-humans, and in which way you can think we can do this. We have to rephrase or rethink these value in order to attribute them to non-human, or no, or we have simply to apply our classical way of understanding human rights to non-humans.
Well, I think the word that they use isn't freedom so much as autonomy, right? Autonomy, maybe not dignity, but well, I'm trying to remember the exact. It's in the Swiss Constitution. But yeah, okay. Yeah, so Switzerland's constitution recognizes the dignity, and they use the word dignity. That's usually a word that we don't associate with, we associate more with humans, of individual plants, while Supreme Courts ruled that the Amazon is a rights-bearing entity. So the idea to have non-human rights, I think it's like 20 years old, and maybe there's 7 countries that have adopted it into constitutions or legal frameworks, but it's a way to give local people protection over their environment, right? You're familiar with non-human rights, or you're not familiar with non-human rights?
Yeah.
Oh, you are familiar. Okay. So I have to admit, I mean, all that I know is that there's movements in several countries to, like, for example, the water law is a kind of non-human right. And that the water law is meant to be, the worldwide water law is meant to be global, not just local. But all that I'm trying to say is that if initially the Human Rights Declaration was only accepted by 40 countries, now it's accepted by 70 countries, and even more conventions have been added. I imagine that at some point, more conventions will be added. That's all I can really say. But I think the kinds of rights that they're giving non-humans are maybe less freedom and more autonomy, obviously not education, or it's kind of interesting. Water wasn't even a human right until 2010. Water wasn't a part of the original UN human right, the Human Rights Declaration. So yeah, I don't know more specifically. Maybe there's someone else who knows more specifically. I only know from my research. I mean,
Okay.
I haven't read a book on non-human rights, but I should probably if there is one.
Okay.
But I think autonomy is the word that they would use as opposed to freedom. And of course, in this case, it sounds like the Swiss have used dignity, which even is a level above autonomy, in my opinion. I mean, it's.
Okay, thank you. Alberto?
Yes, thanks. Thanks indeed, Sue, for this very stimulating paper. If I may add my name to the list of people interested in receiving the paper,
Sure.
I will be really glad to read more carefully what you presented and discuss it with us. To me, as far as I have understood it, your proposal is really rich and really innovative. I would say another way for reshaping a variant of the, well, let me summarize, a variant of the virtue ethics, you know, instead of saying, okay, perhaps we have a value approach, which is another one, as a not contractualistic approach, neither, let's say, immediately a reciprocity, directly or indirectly reciprocity approach, the sort of third or fourth way for us. And so this is really rich and really stimulating, and I'm really in depth with you about that. I have just a couple of issues which might be summarized, well, so far, at least so far, that might be summarized into a sort of a stability issue. Well, we have a stability issue, to me at least, which is twofold. On the one hand, stability issue towards states or government, and a stability issue towards individuals. Let me try to give more evidence to the two angles of this corner. As soon as you were trying to say, also in the last part of your paper, or of your presentation, actually, okay, states might, let's say, open up the floor and stimulate individuals, citizens to operate in along certain way by introducing / facilitating some choices or some behaviors. Let me say, but if and this kind of action is a sort of value a part of a value approach, that one that you depicted to us. But in this case, well, let me see, we might imagine, we could imagine a sort of a stability of values, or a value choice which is related to the specific government that is at stake in that specific moment. Meaning, we have to consider that different governments or different parties, different political perspectives might change the stability of values that are at stake. Well, basically, we experienced that in the US with the passage between Obama, Trump, and then Biden. But this is just a matter of fact. We might create dozens of those examples, also by referring to European countries. What, of course, this is less evident for us, but also by referring to South American countries or African countries, Asian countries, and so on and so forth. And this is a matter of, let's say, systemic stability, meaning the stability in a nation, referred to a national actor. Then there is another micro problem of stability, at least to me, and this is the stability of values within the individuals. Well, one of the last bullet point of your slide was, well, while virtues are always for another, values are your own. They are up to you. But this means that the process, this is a sort of a, let's say, intellectual, I don't want to say intellectualistic approach, but to see if you have those values, it's a good thing. If you don't have, it's a bad thing, but we have not so much to do. We can try to do something, but in the very end, it's up to you. So how to transfer, establish, enforce values in single persons, and also in the trespassing or in the passage between individual to individual, face to face, group to groups, how to enforce that bridge. And this is another point. In order to enforce the stability of values, not just an opportunity given by chance, but as a stability, a moral stability / a normative stability, which is in a sense guaranteed time by time, or within and allowing a diachronical path. These were basically the two issues that came to my mind by listening to your presentation. Thanks again. And
okay.
Thanks indeed.
So I don't know if I can answer your questions, but on the level of national stability, I totally agree. This is a huge problem, and the voters seem to be swayed crazily in one direction than another direction. And back in the day when, I mean, I think also like in Europe, the people vote differently for the EU representatives than they do for their own local, right? I don't know about in Italy, but for sure in some countries they're more liberal at the EU, and other countries they're more conservative. So there's already this kind of imbalance between the EU Parliament and the local, the national governments, right? So we do have this huge problem, I agree, of stability between voters, but it seems to me that you know, probably only 5% of the world's population knows about the slow food movement. I don't even know. But I think what's great about it is that it entered the people with the biggest footprint, right? And so that's, I guess, what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking less about, like you say, how do we get the right values into people? I think most people have never really even thought about like I said, my worry is that people don't really make their values explicit. But in making their values explicit, I think it gives them a sense, it empowers them in a way that doesn't empower them if they never think about it. But maybe I'm wrong. But I agree with you. I don't think there's going to be people that are going to come up with the right values and the wrong values. The more important thing is that, are your values in line with your identity? That's the only, and it should be also the case that people change. They get more information, they get more, but it's the kind of thing I imagine people would decide, do I want to have 1 child or 4 children? I didn't know that 4 children will increase my footprint 4 times, and I should be responsible for my footprint. That's how I'm thinking about this. I'm just thinking about it. If people say, oh, I'm really ecological and I'm really worried about climate change, for my children, and then they're, creating lots of kids, and each kid has their own house. I mean, everybody knows people whose kids live in all different houses. I'm just saying, lots of people are acting against their interests. I see it all the time. I'm not trying to point my finger. I don't even think that the people who are acting against their interests, my wonder is, have they thought about it? Did they have a mechanism to think about it? What is the mechanism to think about it? And anyway, I think it's less abstract than the unexamined life is not worth living, in a certain sense. What is that? Anyway, the goal is to sort of give people the tools. Like I said, it's the last chapter in a book about values. The goal is to sort of give people the tools to identify their values. And it's the case that the governments are so unstable that makes me want to take it away from the governments. I want to take this process away from, I think the process has political ramifications when the people locally are electing their politicians, and they're trying to, and maybe politicians run on the campaign that we will give the river a right, or we'll give farmer, maybe they're running on platforms of non-human rights, but at the same time, the people have the values first, and then the politicians jump on board rather than waiting for governments. Because as you say, the governments are changing really quickly. I didn't really see, but of course, my target audience are the worst offenders. My target audience isn't, middle-class people or poor people that barely have a footprint. My target audience are the people that, the giant hotels and the giant, I don't know. It's interesting. Anyway, we could go on and on. I don't really know how to measure the worst offenders, but there are people that have markedly large footprints compared to other people. And it's that group of people that I'm more interested in persuading to act differently, or to think about the ramifications of their activities. That's another thing I want to bring up. So during the pandemic, what occurred to me that I had never thought of in my life is that people actually think it's a right to buy whatever you can afford. I don't know why I never thought about this, but people just think that if you can afford it, it's your right to purchase it. And that is definitely a value that needs to get changed, because so long as people have that value, we have no choice but to, we're never going to get behind, we're never going to be able to curtail climate change, because there's too many people that can afford to buy too many things. And the more they buy, the more it puts pressure on the footprint. So I don't know if that answers. I don't dream that this problem, this approach will appeal to or land in the laps of many people. But in my opinion, if it lands in the laps of, some of the people who are going to go on to have a big footprint, like Elon Musk or someone like that, I would be very excited if I could get the ears of someone who has a big footprint. I don't know. I don't know if I answered your question. Do you have a follow-up?
Well, if I may very quickly follow up, yes, I see that, well, perhaps we are on the same page as for the macro stability process, the macro stability issue. I don't know which is your opinion about the what I might rephrase as a micro stability issue, that one related to the transmission peer-to-peer, so individuals to individual, how to transfer, how to enstrand, how to enforce those values. This is another piece of your theory which is really relevant.
Okay, all right. Your point you're talking about, where at the very end of my paper, I talk about that values are transferable but not preferences. Is that your point? Well, I don't know how that can be enforced, like you say. It's just, I was taking it as a psychological evaluation, that your parents might like, parents have certain preferences. They just imagine their kids will like them. The kids don't like the preferences, but for some reason it's observed by psychologists that the values, so if the family has a value for family, if the family has a value for a family meal, if the family has a value for, spending time, going on a vacation every year, whatever the values are, it seems the psychologists have observed that values are more easily transferable, or more likely to be transferred than just mere preferences. That people's preferences are more, what is the word? They're not, just because your parents like something or just because your friends like something, they can't really get you to like it, but your friends can influence your values, and your parents. My point was more psychological than philosophical. So, but how does it get enforced? I guess it gets enforced because, you know, we hang out with people that have our values. I mean, it's not, I mean, I have friends who are totally different than me and don't share my values, but we spend a lot of time debating, you know. I wouldn't I wouldn't necessarily call, I mean, they're my friends, but I don't let them influence me. You know, they're not influencing my values, they're maybe strengthening my values, or yeah. The contrary people are strengthening our values, I think, but they're probably not taking anything from us, or from me anyway. I don't know, maybe they are. But I do think that we do spend a lot more time sharing values and acting on our values than we make clear. And I think it's and on that level, I think it's really personal. I think it's really, we have commitments and we act on them because we want other people to see us as having those commitments and acting on them. But I don't know how this can be enforced other than telling people that it's a good idea and then they can think about it. Just the way when we teach philosophy to our undergrads, they never thought about any of these ideas. What they take away is anybody's guess, you know, what they, how they absorb, how they integrate all this information into their lives is anybody's guess. But I think it's important to bring it up either way. But enforcing is difficult. But I mean, we're enforcing the climate change treaties so badly as it stands, I mean, with the exception of Europe, that I don't know. I think that unfortunately, we don't have much to lose. We have a lot to lose, but not in a new policy anyway. But I don't think we have as long as the slow food movement. What?
No, I would just say thanks for this. I see that the intrinsic and, let's say, systemic difficulty that related to that, and also the liminarity between moral philosophy, moral psychology, and social psychology of such a kind of issues. But really, really stimulating. Well, food for thinking, food for thinking again, and more in depth about that.
Okay, by the way,
Thanks.
Fausto wrote in chat, he mentioned the seminar we had with Samantha Knoll. I think that the video of the seminar can be of any interest for you, because it was, the topics was balancing food security and ecological resilience, and she spoke about food and slow food. So you can take a note. There is a link in the chat, and you can listen the seminar if you want.
Okay,
it
great.
was one of our previous seminar. Okay, another question from Alessandro.
Thank you very much for interesting paper, and I would like to read the written version, me too. And I have a couple of questions, more or less, you have just explained, but are quite simple, but maybe can better understand my interpretation of your talk. And these two questions are: what is the nature of values, and what is the nature of virtue? Because I can see from your talk that there is a sort of mixings of three different traditions, because we have, for example, the tradition referring to Hume, and then values are coming from emotion and passions, but at the same time, I can see the tradition referring to Kant, that values are absolute, and so we have the possibility to know values. And at the same time, there is the tradition referring to virtue that is recalling me the heritage of Aristotle and the notion of the right middle between two excesses. And so, starting from these two different questions, what is the nature of values, what is the nature of virtue? There is a third question related to what do you think about moral pluralism, because our societies in the Western culture are characterized by moral pluralism, and we have different interpretation of values. And so the problem is the agreement about what is the most important values, especially to climate justice or climate policies related to what is better to do for mitigating or for changes this awful process that we are living now. And so my idea is not possible to call or to recall the idea of interest, not of the majority, but the interest of everybody to enforce some practical policies based on an agreement in some different values for reaching the objective we want to grasp for mitigating the process of climate change. Thank you very much.
Okay, wow. Okay, what was the first, you said virtue related to Kant that was absolute, and excuse me, values related to Kant that's absolute, and virtue related to Aristotle. What was the first program that you said?
It was, there is, about values, I read in your paper two different traditions. The first one is related to Hume, that is
Hume.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
referring to moral to moral sense, more or less. And the other tradition is referred to Kant, that is, there is the possibility to know values because they are absolute. And these are the two mainstream traditions related to moral philosophy from the modern era to nowadays, more or less.
Okay, so it's been a long time since I would have read Hume on moral philosophy, but what I was thinking was I actually became reinterested in values, thinking when I read that book by Qasim Qassam, it's called Self-Knowledge for Humans. Has anyone read that book? Anyway, so it's in that book where he talks about values being an element of substantial self-knowledge. He makes a distinction between trivial self-knowledge and substantial self-knowledge. Okay, and he says that most philosophers are strangely involved in this more trivial form and not the substantial. That's his whole argument, that the problem with philosophy is it's focused on the wrong kind of self-knowledge. Okay, now I guess what I want to say is that as it comes to the public, like public policy, I totally agree that you could never come to any kind of consensus about values. However, what I do think is that we do get a lot of values from our environment, from where we grow up, from where we live. And this is why I'm using Sweden as this model. It totally makes sense to me that Swedes would be so disciplined about climate change because their entire lifestyle is rooted in their environment. It's not to say no other countries are like that, but they're a kind of an amazing. I mean, when I first heard the Swedish academics were not allowed to fly to conferences, I almost fell off my chair. I mean, they do fly to aesthetics conferences in the States, but I'm just saying, if it's in Europe, they're really asked to take a train. They're not allowed to fly. They're discouraged from flying. It's strong, and that really impressed me because those are people probably they would rather fly. It would be easier to fly from Stockholm to Helsinki, but their government's saying you have to take a train. Okay, all right. So that's when I started looking into this role of discipline and the connection between values. And I do think we get our values probably more from our environment and than anything. And that's why I think that that's why I also use the example of the COP process where you have these thousands of people that arrive. I mean, I'm not really sure that thousands of people descending on a city is the most ecological strategy, but at the same time, I'm very much in favor of all these different kinds of people having a voice that would ordinarily be totally, if they just brought their UN representatives or their climate change representatives, they would be totally invisible. And the fact that they show up and they express different issues that are important to them, those different issues that are important to them are also really tied to their environment. So I'm not really sure that my ideas of values would have much to do with Hume or Kant or even Aristotle, because none of those fellows, they just happen to be fellows, none of those philosophers thought a thing about the relationship between values and an environment, but specifically where you're from, what you grew up with, what your relationship to trees, your relationship to the local insects, animals. And when I talk about food, I talk about the same thing, about how everyone thinks that food is somehow particular to different people, but it's really particular to different people living in different environments, having access to different tools. You know, everyone historically was trying to figure out, well, how to make the best of their environment. So all the unusual, you know, food preferences, they're not really preferences as much as they are exemplary of the history of the people on the land. So I guess that's what I'm trying to say, is that I think that my idea of environment or values is very different because it's really tied to the environment. Values come out of the environment. They don't come out of a list of ways people should behave independent of their environment. So indeed, a big country like Italy, with people living in many different environments, are going to have huge disagreements about values. So I guess at a certain point, you know, people living in cities are going to be very different than people living, you know, in the country, in the south of Italy, for example. And the point being that hopefully they can enact their values locally and then find politicians who can represent their values. So in my view, you go up, you start from your local environment, then your local government, then you elect more leaders, and then finally, I mean, the country of Italy would be still very pluralistic and very diverse when it came to values related to the environment, but at least more values are represented than the current scheme, I think. But is your point that people have different values and different approaches to climate mitigation? I mean, I think that if everyone were focused on protecting their environment, their local environment, we wouldn't have a climate change problem. I really
Yeah,
believe
and
that.
from my point of view, there is the problem of economic. I don't know if you can hear me well, but from my point of view, the problem is related to economic interest, more or less, because the climate change is created by industrialization and the idea of obtaining more and more gains by resources and things like that. This is what I can say, a really summarized idea. But the problem is that this kind of approach in industrial production is transferring an idea, a Weltanschauung, a vision of the world to people, and at the same time a set of ethical toolbox that is giving some kind of values. If you consider the Western way of life, more or less, is quite similar because we are all the same in the same culture, what I can say. But the problem is that for climate change, I think we should face solution in a globally perspective, because it's not possible to have some policies in mitigation in Italy, in USA, in England, but not in China, not in India, or in other countries, because otherwise, what I can say, the benefits are not achievable to all the people. And so I think we have really different cultures in the world and different ideas and different principles, different values. So one of the most important problems, but it's not only related to a global perspective, but also to the liberal countries, is the moral pluralism, because maybe we can share that freedom is a value, but we should have different ideas about what is the content of freedom for me, maybe, or other people. For me, for example, is going outside, riding my bicycle, but for other people is to waste a river because it gives the possibility to enrich his family. I don't know, this is from my point of view, one of the most important problems related to climate change and the problem of values at the same time.
Okay, so I think that, I mean, to be clear, the values I'm talking about mostly are environmental values. So I don't know if I would count freedom in that, but the fellow who has to raise his family and is willing to erase a river to raise his family or whatever, he doesn't live near that river. If he lived near that river, I think he'd have different values. And this is, I guess, the point I'm trying to make, is that the reason why industry or transnational corporations have done so much damage is because it's far from their headquarters. And so if we can make people think about their own environment and their relationship to their own environment, maybe even CEOs would change. their behaviors, or they would be more respectful, or I sort of want to empower the people who live in the communities that are being destroyed by industrialization, and inform the leaders who are doing this that they're acting against their values, because they wouldn't allow other people to do that same action in their own hometown. I don't know. It's sort of like the rumor that in Monsanto's cafeteria they serve organic food. I think it's just a rumor, but you can imagine Monsanto, that people who invented GMOs, if they're eating organic food in their cafeteria, it seems like a hugely hypocritical move. They're forcing everyone else to eat this, you know, oh, I guess you guys call it OMG, this genetically modified food, and yet they're sitting there eating organic food. I think it's just a rumor, but that's the kind of story I'm trying to make people think about, where their own actions are contradicting what they're doing to the world. And I don't really think that, yeah, I think it's possible. I don't really think it's impossible for people to have jobs that aren't just simply destroying the world. Do you?
I hope so.
But I have a question. I don't understand the second word. Are you saying moral provincialism, or moral, what's the second word? Moral.
No, I see. There is my idea is there are different paradigms in interpreting, sorry, the content of values that are referred to the different contexts that are should be cultural context, because if you have an high level education, maybe you are trained in interpreting, or you have a critical sense about the world. Otherwise, if you don't have received this kind of education, probably is more related to feelings. I don't know. I didn't. I don't want to create an image that is based on a different of classes in society. But from my point of view, in facing the problem related to climate change and climate justice, is really the difference we have in considering principle and values. For example, Chinese guys should have different ideas of freedom, for example, or of good at the same time. So I think the problem in enforcing policies is related to the agreement of the meaning of the word, of the ideas of values, and then maybe we can enforce policies for different for changing the world.
But the question I'm trying to ask or answer is, why are people not willing to follow just burdens? If there's just targets and there's just burdens, why do people feel the burdens are too onerous?
Maybe because they don't know this kind of burdens, or maybe because they are more interested in trying to find a way of life that is aiming to sustainment or basic or try to respond to basic needs, because a lot of people doesn't have the possibility to have the basic needs.
Right. Well, I don't really think that, in my view, the people who are trying to achieve their basic needs are probably not the biggest climate change offenders. They probably have very low footprints. I think the people with the high footprints are the people that are flying all over the place and owning multiple homes and going on ski vacations and, having investments in stocks that do damage all over the place, and all they care about is, I don't know. I think, what?
I agree.
Yeah, I don't think that people trying to make a subsistence living, I'm not worried about them. I mean, I don't really know. I'd love to see an economics report, because people always, Ryanair supposedly has one of the top 10 footprints of any business in Europe, right? But I think to myself, like, Ryanair, their travelers don't usually stay in hotels. If they stay, they might stay in a pensione, but they insert themselves in the city. There's a whole other level of tourism where you have to build an entire infrastructure to entertain and to, what's the word? they're not coming to visit a city. Whereas I'm not sure, because I'm making some guesses here. Maybe they're wild guesses, but it's interesting that Ryanair can be blamed as having the highest carbon footprint of the top 10 businesses in Europe, which is probably not what?
No,
It's
no,
probably
no,
not
no.
much. I think it's true, but their tourist is a totally different kind of tourist. Their tourist is someone who goes to the city, either stays at a family or stays at a pensione, and goes and visits all the things in the city. So in a weird way, they help the cities in a ways, I mean, maybe not Venice, but in ways that other kinds of tourism are just totally extraneous to the cities, extraneous to the environment. Anyway, I don't know, we're maybe getting off topic, but I do think a lot about, I always say I'm not worried about the Ryanair tourist. Maybe their airplanes have a huge footprint, but the Ryanair tourist is not invasive. They're eating the same food everybody else is eating. They're not going to restaurants that require a giant infrastructure and a giant, you know what I'm saying? I don't know, maybe
Yeah,
just.
yeah. Okay, I think we are monopolizing the debate.
The discussion. Thank you. We have 3 more questions on our list on the table. The first one is Fausto, then Francesco, and Israel at the end.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation and also for this discussion. Very interesting, very useful. I want to go to the first part of your presentation, actually, because one of your central claims, at least in the first slides and also in the first part of the paper, seems to be that actually backward-looking principles of climate justice are like useless or bad. I don't know how to say it, but actually they are, let me put it in this way, they are useless for climate mitigation because backward-looking principles do not prevent people from emitting CO2. And I follow you on this because actually, in my opinion, if you wanna have a climate transition, you should look at the future, not at the past. Meaning that you should introduce carbon pricing, and you should find a way for countries to cooperate on carbon pricing, so you don't have carbon leakage and so on. So I agree with you that somehow we should put backward-looking principles apart. But there are some objection that usually people and scholars move against those people who say something like you say, and also like I would say that actually backward-looking principles are not the right focus. So I wanna like make this objection to you and see how you respond to it and if you consider this objection like relevant. So one objection, I guess your argument is the empirical objection, meaning that there are some people that say, look, actually, if developed country pay their climate debt, and so they give money to developing country, actually it's useful in terms of climate mitigation because developing country will have money to invest in adaptation, in loss and damage, but also in the energy transition, in renewable energy. So this is one objection. Then there is another objection, is the ethical objection, meaning that some people will say, well, the fact that actually repaying the climate debt is not useful for climate mitigation is not a good reason not to repay the climate debt. Because some people, for example, consider, like, imagine this case in which you owe me some money because you caused damage to me, to my property, my car, and so on. And then you say, okay, Fausto, but I will not give you the money that I owe to you because I'm sure that you're going to use this money for buying synthetic drugs here in Pisa and so on. I could respond, well, but this is not the point of compensation. You owe me the money because you caused damage to me, regardless of the consequences of repaying the money. And then there is the third objection, and the third objection is to do with the currency of justice, because in my view, when you say that backward-looking principles are not useful, you imagine like the compensation in economic terms. But there are also some people who can say, well, the compensation should take place in terms of emissions, not of money. So actually the compensation means that developing countries should be allowed to emit more than developed countries now. And this is a different argument. So these are the three objections, and I'm interested if you think that they're relevant and how you respond to it. So the empirical one, the ethical one, and the currency one.
Okay, so normally my view is that backward-looking schemes are problematic for environmental degradation, right? Because you can't really, you can't compensate people for having destroyed their environment, or if you can, people will just give the money and destroy it. So that's really not in the, that's not part of the, that argument was outside this idea of the treaties. But so far as I know, one of the big complaints about the, from the participants in the climate change conferences, the annual is that the countries have failed to so far address this idea of giving, of redistributing funds, right? There were supposed to be these funds that people could apply for so that they could, I'm trying to see, it's in my original paper. Those funds never have, they still have not yet materialized. They're just focused on the targets at this point. They're not focused yet on redistributing money. So it could very well be that if the wealthier countries could give, you know, either they could give money to poor countries to develop more energy efficient electric plants, or compensate them some way, that could work. But I'm at this point, though, I would like people to spend more time on the things that will work, like regenerative agriculture, fixing all the waterways. I mean, there's so much to be done that's climate, that would cool the climate, that doesn't really involve having big debates about how to redistribute incomes. And then, of course, there's always the worry that you give people, like you say, you give people money, or you give nations money, and they don't do with it what they're supposed to. But let's, what is the name of the, there was supposed to be, I'm trying to remember where the, so anyway, if, for example, well, you're talking about distributive, backwards looking distributive justice. So it could very well be that in the case of climate change, we could distribute resources and people could do more with less. But I think, in my opinion, that we should try to figure out, before we have big political battles about redistributing income, which we haven't been able to do since 2015, then we should at least have a system where we are focused on having just burdens, so that we can actually create our just targets. I guess I'm more focused on how do we convince people, or how do we get people to adopt just burdens so that we can meet our just targets, rather than simply shifting. I mean, because there has to be, all the poorer countries, the developing nations, are always complaining that at COP, they say they're going to figure out ways to redistribute money, but every year they have the conference and they never get to that point. So I mean, that's not a good argument against it, but it's an argument in favor of looking for another solution that actually might happen independent of COP. I mean, I have to say, I'm not very excited by COP, or not by COP, by these annual, any of the climate agreements, I think are really problematic. They're either too weak, or they don't talk about water, they don't talk about soil. I mean, I think it's bizarre that these people go to climate change meetings and water and soil are hardly ever discussed. And if you look in the treaties, it's like maybe once they discuss these things. That none of these treaties address, in my opinion, is the elephant in the room. And that's the degradation of land and the lack of groundwater replenishment, you know, and no focus, if you don't have a focus on it. So I guess I think that that there's actions that can be taken that wouldn't require wealthy countries beating up poor countries and telling them that they don't want to give them any money. But maybe someone knows something new, because this is what I understood, that the developing nations are always complaining. I'm trying to remember what that fund is supposed to be. There's some sort of fund that they were supposed to enact, but they haven't enacted it yet. Do you know something different, Fausto?
The Green Climate Fund, I think is.
But have they enacted it yet, or it's just something they talk about? It's to come.
No, it's active, but they try to collect money, but they are always short of money. Now at Glasgow they promise a lot of money, but let's see, because since Copenhagen actually they are falling short of paying the famous $10 billion that they owe as climate finance. So just pledges and promises actually.
So I guess, you know, this is a worry that that's something that it could work in theory, but I worry that for whatever reason, the developing nations keep taking it off the table. They don't really pay. They're not as, oh yeah, here we are. Yeah, the Green Climate Fund. All right. Anyway, until people start acting on their values, I don't see them, you know. So I guess you're correct. I would have to say that distributive justice does have a value in the sense of the Green Climate Fund, but I'd like to see the Green Climate Fund come on board and take a bigger role to play. And I don't even think that the Green Climate Fund could necessarily work if water and soil aren't a bigger issue or a bigger topic or a bigger importance. Because I think the real problem is water. I think if we were able to focus on water, we would solve a lot of these problems. But yeah, that's just my, because
Thank you very much.
What?
I would say thank you for your answer.
I just want to make one more comment. From what I understand, all of the research done on water or that has to do with climate change is just simply predicting what future patterns of rainfall will look like. If the temperature rises this much, if the temperature rises that much. And in fact, there should be far more research on, you know, getting rivers to flow and replenishing groundwater and all these strategies. And so it may be, in fact, that gives credence to the fact that if people saw rivers as having non-human rights, it would force them to address these kinds of really problems that are, in a weird way, easy to address and more important than some of the ones that other people are talking about. When I say more important, I don't mean in a hierarchical. I mean they could have a bigger impact quicker. That's the point. Without a government, without an international governmental body that seems to haggle more than it comes up with solutions.
Okay, thank you, Sue. Francesco.
Hi, Shu. Thanks for your talk. I really appreciated it. And I would be interested as well to read the paper on which it was based. I have just 3 clarificatory questions revolving around your conceptualization of value. And although they actually partly overlap with some points raised by Alessandro Chiesi, I shared them with you nonetheless. So as a first point, I appreciated your attempt of unpacking the concept of value by distinguishing environmental values, ameliorative values, and explicit values. It seems to me that after all, there might be an intersection among these kinds of values, so that value can be environmental, ameliorative, and explicit at the same time. Yet I'm not sure I have grasped what makes explicit values explicit. I mean, if they are so defined in accordance with their being readily articulated by their bearers, is their being explicit tied to their salience in response to a given context? Because if it is so, you might consider explicit values as based on some dispositional property, that is, they're being sensitive to certain contexts or stimuli. As a second point, I was wondering, does your taxonomy make room for values that, beyond promoting human and non-human well-being, do so to the deliberate and massive detriment of some humans and non-human beings' well-being? Because I was thinking of intrinsically particularistic values as those which inform, for instance, white supremacism or savage consumerism. that some people might be willing to refer to as part of their value system. Are such values pejorative on your account instead of ameliorative? And as a third and last question, it would be maybe worth considering how your theory of values can relate to philosophical anthropology or theory of human nature, as you like. In a nutshell, is beholding some values a kind of meta value, or does it just come about that as an empirical matter of fact, once socialized, humans need to behold some values? I hope this does not sound as rhetorical flourishing, but my point is whether you are interested in investigating how values shape and constitute the human forms of life more generally. And about this, if I may, I suggest a brilliant essay by Andrew Sayer, which is titled "Why Things Matter to People," where he basically addresses this question, and I share a link in the chat box because I think it's worth mentioning.
How do you spell his last
It may
name?
help. And I'm done with my questions. Sorry if it took so long.
But how do you spell Andrew's last name? Andrew.
Sorry, I'm afraid I didn't got your last comment.
How do you spell Andrew's last name?
Andrew Sayer, is it wrong?
I don't know. How do you spell it? S-A-L?
S-A-Y-E-R.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, however, in the link that I just posted, you can find the reference to the essay I was referring to.
Okay, so
It's very brilliant, actually.
I'm sure. It sounds interesting. All right, so the question, why should values be explicit? I agree that I do think, so when are they explicit? When are they implicit? I think that most of us have implicit values. We act on things, we go to certain movies, we go to certain concerts. We're not really thinking very much about whether we're acting on our values or whether we're just I think most of the time we just do things and we're not so conscious of our values, right? But maybe someone says to you like, oh, well, why did you go to that movie? Or why did you see that concert? They're trying to find out something about you. They're trying to find out why that interests you or how that interests you. And I think that it's in those moments when we're like, maybe we just say, oh, we're just curious, right? So then you'd say, oh, you have a value for curiosity or something like that. But that wouldn't really be an environmental value. You know, why do you spend all your time recycling or something? I guess that would be more of a value, of an environmental value. But I do think that it's only in making things explicit that we'll ever know whether things are in line or out of line. I mean, that's, I guess, really important for me is how do we know whether we're, how do we check ourselves? How do we double check? I think we mostly hide ourselves from ourselves. We mostly, pretend we're one way and do another thing. I don't know. I think that's a kind of another instability between the way we think we are and the way we actually act or think we act. So maybe the whole goal of making values explicit is to just simply have a reason for people to articulate things in a way that they wouldn't ordinarily articulate things, right? I don't know. Yes?
I was just wondering whether the point in their being explicit is the fact that they are, shared in a public sphere, or that they are readily articulate in the meaning that they are dispositional. So they are reactive in response to a given context.
Okay, so first they're just, okay, so thank you. First, they're dispositional for sure. We act on them. We see other people see us acting on them. I don't know at what level they're shared. Maybe they're only shared at the level that other people are observing us. Other people are adopting them. Other people are thinking, oh, that's a good way of being, that's a good, I think they only get shared when other people when they become prescient, like salience is a good word, when they become prescient to other people, that is something a way that they might want to be. It reminds me of, I teach Descartes' discourse of method, and he tells us, to watch the most wise people and to only copy their actions, right? So there's something in action and that shares our, that shows us that our values are dispositional. So maybe if someone said, oh, it's always, never tell a lie, it's a bad idea, we just go, okay, whatever. But if we see that this other person has some sort of great success and not lying, or we see how they can, you know, function in the world without lying, or function in the world without stealing, or all the things they tell us not to do, then maybe that has a much greater impact. So I agree that the values are dispositional. At some point, they're shared when other people notice them or take them into consideration. So as far as this taxonomy, I was thinking, you know, in fact, the white supremacist, well, maybe in fact, 90% of the time they have terrible values, but if they're, they could have great environmental values. I think we have a group in America called Ducks Unlimited, and Ducks Unlimited is like hunters who, but they
Sorry
really
for interrupting, but how are they called?
Ducks Unlimited. It's
Ducks
a kind of
Unlimited.
They're an NGO in the States, but they're mostly right-wing crazy people. But at the same time, they're all hunters, and they want to save the ducks. They want to save the birds. Their motivation is to kill them, but at the same time, they have put a lot more pressure on the U.S. government to clean the rivers and to clean the air and to do things. Even though their motivation is bad, they're effectively, they see themselves as environmentalists. Okay, so, and it's true. They have a lot of power and they do a lot for the environment. Okay, so when I think of like the white supremacist, they too might have some interesting environmental, they certainly don't have any social values, but they might have some sort of interesting environmental values that could be of use. I don't know. I don't really know any white supremacists, luckily, but I don't know. But for sure, the savage consumerists, okay, so I think it would be interesting to ask them, what is your value? Why are you a savage? Why do you think you have to own everything? Why do you have to buy all this stuff? Why, you know, I think that when you ask them these questions, they might tell you that they are just bored. They have nothing else to do. I don't know, whatever. But are these pejorative values? I think the most healthy thing is that they self-identify as a white suprematist and they self-identify as the savage consumerism, because I would say that most people who are actually white supremacists would say that they're not even racists. And this is part of the whole problem. Part of the problem is that I have, you know, people don't see themselves for what they are. And even when other people call them out and say, you know, you're just a white suprematist, they say, oh, you were just a victim. But how do we develop the tools to get people to understand that they are white supremacists or that they are savage consumerists? I don't really know, because it doesn't really help to insult them, because A, they're immune from the insulting. If they're acting on their values, then technically they're immune from being insulted. If they're acting on their values, then I think it's important that they acknowledge their values and they decide whether in fact that's a value they want to hold, or that's a value that that goes against their, you know, that goes against their self-image. I mean, if people are proud to be a white suprematist, I don't see there's much that you can do to change them. It's only the people that are not proud to be white supremacists that would appeal to my program. So maybe if you're going to say that wealthy people that are the biggest offenders, I actually don't think wealthy people are proud to be the biggest offenders. I just think they don't know any, well, maybe I'm naive, but I don't think anyone with lots of money is intentionally trying to destroy the earth. I just don't even think that they imagine the ramifications of their daily actions. I don't know. It reminds me of anyway, there's a social bank account in Europe. It's a Spanish bank. Probably some of you, it starts with a T. I can't remember what it's called. But anyway, they give like hardly any money back. And my husband is very happy to keep his money in that bank, because he's convinced that if he doesn't earn any money, any interest on his money, then he's not exploiting anyone. And I'm like, well, yeah, you're the one who's getting exploited. But the point I'm trying to make is that that people don't think that when they earn 10% on their investments or 5% or whatever, that they're only earning that money on the back of other kinds of problems. So the only way I can imagine that we can raise this this awareness is if they're really in touch with their values. This is what I'm trying to say. The people that are getting lots of money, returns on their money, aren't thinking about their values. They're thinking about their pocketbooks. Okay. So the last thing about human nature, do we need to hold values? I don't think we need to, but I think everybody does have values. Whether they make them explicit or not is a different story. But I do think that I actually think it would be impossible to even get out of bed or to know what you're going to do that day if you don't have values. I mean, I think that values pretty much structure our day-to-day existence. Whether we recognize it is a different story. But I don't know that all values. Yeah, I think that most values are implicit, that we live our lives with implicit values. And it's only when we're passionate about something or we make something a priority or we're asked about it, do we ever make them explicit. And but I think the only way we can self-check ourselves or empower people that live in the environment is to be more explicit. I guess that's my only interest in explicit values is so that we can know whether our values, our actions and values are in line, and to know. And I would think that if the Swedish people, if you were to say to the Swedish, I actually went to Sweden during the pandemic, and we were amazed that no one was wearing masks. It was like being on a vacation from the pandemic. But anyway, I think if you had said to them, you know, you're going to spread the disease more. I mean, they really weren't thinking about. They were sort of thinking that they were immune, that they weren't really thinking that there was a causal relationship between not wearing masks and spreading the disease. Anyway. But they're really clear about the causal relationship between carbon footprints and their environment. So I don't know if that's, but I will read this book, Why Things Matter. Or is it a book or a paper?
It's a book, actually.
Okay,
yeah,
it sounds good.
Worth reading, though. Thank you for
Because
your efforts.
that must have to do with values. If it's Why Things Matter, it must be about values, right?
Yeah, of course it is.
Yeah.
Okay, the very last question, Israel.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I really appreciated it. And actually, it brought me to, it made me think about I think it's the most important work of the philosopher J. Baird Callicott, which who does something that sounds like a tentative. Actually, he explicitly mentions that he is a tentative of documenting various the attempts of various peoples to put their environmental ethics into practice, right? And in so doing, actually, the actions that he documents are embedded in values which are local, and so now this, of course, raises a big question, a big issue which is how can the world's many and diverse environmental philosophies be brought together in a complementary and consistent whole, right? So now Callicott writes in his book in 1994, and since then the climate and environmental issues had made a big explosion in terms of acknowledgement and in awareness, and became this collective and global issue that we all virtually we all know about and talk about. And so this question and this challenge that was already put and acknowledged by Callicott is still present, of course, and maybe it's still powerful. It's still powerful, a more powerful question. if I may, just to, because I had the book here, and since it recalls me, I just read two lines to enforce this, because he writes that to augment personal commitment and structural reform, developing a network of indigenous environmental ethics will help set us on our way toward the goal. But we shall need some common environmental attitudes and values on which to base a common vision of a whole and healthy world. Now, this question of a common environmental attitudes and values, I deal with this a lot with this in my research, my own research. I'm the third year of the PhD under the supervision of Professor Pirni, and in my attempt recalling this challenge is to kind of try to search for what would be a cross-cultural, what I call a cross-cultural principle that can facilitate or can serve as a kind of mediator or facilitator to this international dialogue, right? So to this environmental different and international in the broader sense, a set of different values and environmental philosophies and ethics. And I state that what could be a cross-cultural principle in this is the principle of fraternity / solidarity. So this idea of solidarity, of global solidarity, but I retake the kind of forgotten idea of fraternity exactly because of the emotional appeal that it brings with it, that you talk a lot about this. So I would like to just to ask if you have some comments about that, some idea about this, if you see that the search for a common principle. Now Francesco talked about, mentioned what would be a meta value or something like this. Well, I don't see it exactly like this, but things and policies are done in the names of big principles, right? The name of freedom, liberty, or equality, for example. That's why I retake also this historical and symbolic idea and concept of fraternity / solidarity. So if you just have something to comment about that, I would be glad to hear. Thank you.
Well, I hate to be dark, but I was a big believer in solidarity until Putin invaded Ukraine, and I see the whole world as frozen, with even people supporting Putin, like China and the Middle East. Anyway, so I don't know. I don't really know about. Yeah, I would have thought solidarity was much stronger, but anyway, I think it's interesting, a common principle. I would rather rely on the sum of everyone's local values, that people are willing to have just burdens when it's their own territory they're defending. Maybe that's also what the war in Ukraine is telling us, that when if you think of them as putting that sort of, well, it's so dark, but it's definitely the worst thing in my whole life. But if you think of people who are defending their territory as strongly as the Ukrainians are, imagine if they were defending their environmental territory on that level. I think that just burdens people can go very far with just burdens on their own territory. It's the fact that when you feel like you're reaching a global target as opposed to a local target. Anyway, maybe I know this is unrelated to your question, but I'm imagining this solidarity is the global target or the global goal, and it just seems that people are more willing. I don't know. We have a phrase in America: think globally, act locally. Have you heard of that? It's already 30 years old. But anyway, yeah, I think people are more willing to work locally. I don't know how we can come up with values that are cross-cultural, except for the fact that if everyone defended their environment, I'm very certain that we would solve climate change. I think the problem is that people aren't committed enough to their environments. They're not committed enough. They're sort of oblivious to their environments. They're, Yeah, I mean, until 10 years ago, no one in Paris thought there was any nature in Paris. I mean, they were saying, oh, there's no nature in Paris. Now all of a sudden Paris is like the capital of nature, you know, well, not the capital, but the point is that now they see themselves as a city with lots of nature, and it is of a value to them. So, I mean, when I think of how much Paris changed since 2007, I think, wow, not how much it changed physically, but how much the people's attitudes changed and what they're willing to go to defend Paris as a city with lots of nature. It's substantially different. Anyway, so I don't know. I'm going to have to stick to the local because I don't see people working on this global level. I mean, I think that if everyone were very committed to their local environment, I think the sum of it would far exceed having, you know, these global targets, which people don't really seem that interested to, or they don't really understand why they should be suffering so that others can do better, or I don't know. I hope that I didn't throw a wrench in your project.
No, not at all.
I agree we should have common environmental attitudes and values. I don't disagree, but maybe the common value is that we're really committed to our local environment.
Yeah, I see.
That would be my way to extend it. Just the way everyone should be committed to local peace. If we had people committed to local peace, maybe we'd have more global peace. I don't really know.
I see.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation, for this, and for really thank you very much for this lovely discussion, which has been very, very interesting. Also the discussion. So that's all, and we will wait for your next paper for the Rivista di Estetica.
I was thinking of trying to figure something on television, but I couldn't get there.
Okay.
Anyway,
Because we have a new issue, if I remember correctly, on cinema and TV series.
Yeah, but the
So
call
it
is
could be-
closed.
Okay. That doesn't matter.
Sorry.
yeah, I didn't make it. That's why I said I was thinking about something. I didn't make it.
Okay.
But anyway.
Okay. Thank
I
you
was-
very much. Grazie a tutti.
Okay,
See
thank you very much.
On the next
Okay, take
meeting.
care.
Thank you.
Indeed, sure.
Great.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks
Bye.
indeed. Bye. Bye back to you all.